Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Samachet. Today's daf is sponsored by Nancy Kalani in honor of Lisa Kalani's birthday tomorrow. My amazing daughter-in-law with whom I share so much, including the same Hebrew birthday. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with our Mishnah. Going back to the Mishnah, the second part of the Mishnah raised an interesting topic, which is that as soon as the Omer was brought, which we know, although we're going to talk about this today, what exactly permits the Chadash, the new grains, people were already in the shuk selling lots of flour made from these new grains, which raised kind of two problems. Number one, you're not allowed to harvest before the harvest. They harvested the Omer, so when exactly do they have the time to do this? And even if they did somehow find some heter with which to do it, which we'll talk about two heterim today. Yesterday we mentioned one, we'll talk about a second one today. Still, if they make the flour, there's a concern that people are going to end up eating. Okay, what exactly they're eating is a good question, right? Who eats flour? But we'll talk about that soon, right? And basically this sugya is all about noshing in the kitchen or noshing when dealing with food, a very relevant sugya to many of us. I actually get these emails from the New York Times, and b'mikra yesterday I got an email that's from the New York Times cooking. I once was looking at something on Facebook, and since then I've been getting emails from them. So I was all about snacking. It was hysterical. I said, this is, it was about how can you figure out to do healthy snacking. So I said, that is the topic of today. So now we have Rabbi Yehuda, who said it was totally fine that they were doing that. We're not worried about people eating it before the time that was allowed to be eaten. And the rabbis, and Rabbi Meir, who we're going to also see is kind of the mainstream position, the rabbis, or at least the Gemara views it as the rabbis' position, says the rabbis were very upset with this. They were worried that people were going to come to eat. So now the Gemara tries to reconcile this with a different sugya, where we're not really worried about people eating. Now, I want to just clarify, this isn't like yesterday, where we talked about harama and people who on purpose trick and try to do things wrong. This is just, people will end up, like we said, they'll just end up snacking without paying attention. Like on a fast day, you're making food, you might accidentally start eating it, right? Now, nobody says you're not allowed to make food on a fast day, but, we all know that concern. It's just a mistake can happen. So now the Gemara says, what about B'dika Chametz? Rabbi Yehuda says, if you forgot to check for Chametz on Erev Pesach and midday, when it's time to burn the Chametz, you can't check anymore because we're worried you're going to eat, which is the exact opposite of what he said here. And the rabbi said, no, you can check, right, even on Pesach, okay? And certainly on Erev Pesach, and you can check no matter what, because you didn't check for Chametz. You have to check for Chametz. And we're not worried you're going to come to eat it. So the Gemara right now is just dealing with Rabbi Yehuda. Later, they're going to go back to the rabbis and say, well, what's with them? They also contradict Rabbi Meir's position in the Mishnah with the position against Rabbi Yehuda in B'dika Chametz. For this, we're going to have three answers. The first answer is Amar Rabba, Shane Chadash, mitoch shelo hitarta lo ela al yedei kituf, zachorhu. He says, listen, the only way they're going to have these, we're assuming, again, they didn't do something wrong. They didn't cut it before the Omer was cut, unless they had a permission to do it. What would be permission to do it? We'll see one of two things. Either you can do it by hand. Okay, they only forbade it doing it with a sickle or with an implement. But to do it by hand, we assume you're not going to do a lot by hand, and you can do it by hand. So that's permitted. So now if we allow you, we'll get to the other one soon, but right now we're on the first one. Well, if you do it by hand, you're going to remember not to eat it. In other words, as long as you're doing something different, that reminds you, okay? These are reminders. Well, while you're picking it by hand, you're not going to end up eating it, so you don't have to worry that people will end up eating it. So, Amar Abai. Okay, well, your answer is only a partial answer because Tina Ktsira, Tzchina V'Arkadama Yikalamemar. I understand when you're picking it in the fields, you're picking it by hand, you'll remember, you won't eat it then. But at the later stages, you're making it into flour. Remember, there's a whole bunch of things that have to happen until then. While you're grinding, while you're sifting, there's no shinoi that you're doing. There's no change. You're doing it in the normal way. Maybe then you'll forget. Halukashya, tchina berechaya diyada, harkada al gabe nafa. Those you have to also do with shinoi. Okay, if you're going to be selling them, then you grind it with a hand grinder rather than with a millstone that's hand operated rather than by water or by animal. And harkada, you do it you flip the sifter upside down and do it upside down on al gabe, on the back of, instead of on the, inside. Okay, so that resolves the difficulties. But now he raises another difficulty, which will not be resolved. Beit HaShlachim, Deshar Yaktsiva, there's another way where you're allowed to harvest. And that's the Beit HaShlachim, these are the irrigated fields, field that needs irrigating. We already learned that you can't bring it for the Omer. So they actually allow you to pick it before. Also, some people said the reason is because it would get ruined. It was usually ready earlier, and it would get ruined if you left it in the fields too long. So they permitted you to do that. But there's no shinoi when you can actually harvest that normally. Ditnan, kotzrim beitat shlachim shabamakim of a logo chim. We don't make a big pile out of them, but you can already, cut them, harvest them. So ma'i kalamemer. Well, if people are getting it from there, from the irrigated fields, well, then there's no shinoi, there's no change they're doing, and then you're going to have a problem. So, and as people will forget. So Abaye gives a different answer. He doesn't like Rabba's answer. Ela amar Abaye, chadash badil minei. This is answer number 2. Chametz lo badil minei. Chadash, people have spent an entire year, now maybe not entire year because the crop wasn't ready yet, but they haven't touched the crop at all, right? They know that this is the new crop, and they're going to stay away from that. That's something people, right? It's not like it's something you eat every day and then all of a sudden you can't eat it. Like chametz, you eat all the time. There's only 7 days a year. You don't eat it. You might forget and come to eat it. Right? I mean, you can obviously say the opposite, right? People are so crazy about chametz for Pesach. There's no way you're going to eat chametz on Pesach. But this is his theory to try to resolve it. The opposite logic, which is chadash, we never eat until it's really permitted. So it's very easy. People will know this is chadash. They know this is the day of the Omer. This is the day it's going to be permitted. They're not going to come to eat it before. But chametz, they're so used to eating that if you find chametz in your house or you're doing a search, you find chametz, you might actually accidentally eat it. So Amar Rava. So now Rava comes, and you're going to see, I don't know if you already started thinking that's ridiculous, something about what was just said, and we're going to use it the other way in a second. You love rabbinic logic. It can just flip it on its head. So Amar Rava, de Rabbi Yehuda kasha, de Rabbanan lo kasha. So Rava says, stop for a second. All you've been discussing so far is the contradiction between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda, but you didn't point out the contradiction between the rabbis and the rabbis. Now, it's the rabbis and Rabbi Meir, but we assume those who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. So, again, there's a contradiction there too, because in Pesach, they're not worried you're going to eat it, and in Chadash, they're worried you're going to eat it. It was Shelo B'Ratzon Chachamim. So, Ela Amarava, de Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha kedishaninan. So Rava says like this. Rabbi Yehuda, we already resolved. Derabanan, it's just like we said previously. Probably, I accept Abaye, but Derabanan lo kasha. Why not? Huatzmo mechazer alav l'sarfo mecha achal mineh. If you're going to look for chametz, because you have to do bedika chametz to burn it, you're going to end up accidentally eating it, that's ridiculous. Of course you're not going to eat it. So the rabbis were not concerned that you were going to come to eat your chametz on Pesach. When you're searching for it, you're searching to get rid of it. No chance you're going to eat it, but they would be worried specifically on the Omer, that maybe you would eat the chadash. And that's the way he resolves the contradiction. And I don't know if you thought about that as I was saying it, because it does sound kind of ridiculous. You're looking for the chametz, you might accidentally eat it. So that's, again, according to this interpretation, we're going to see a third one in a minute, which the Gemara is not going to like too much. But right now we had option number 1 is because you're doing it some different way, which worked only partially because there's ways that you could have done it that wasn't different and you wouldn't have remembered. But since you do it differently, you'll remember. Okay? Then we had, which obviously doesn't apply to chametz on Pesach and bedika chametz. The second one was chadash. You distance yourself from, so there's no chance. You haven't eaten it yet this year. There's no chance you're going to come to eat it. Chametz, we're so used to eating on a normal basis, you might accidentally eat it on Pesach. And then the rabbis who brought the opposite interpretation, which is, no, dafka, you're going to burn it. There's no way you're going to eat it. Rav Ashi Amar. To Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha. He's not relating to the rabbis, he's just relating to Rabbi Yehuda. Kemach kalitznan. It says it's toasted, or however you under, it's parched flour, meaning you parch it and then you turn it into flour. That's what they would do, right? It was soft in the beginning. When you cut it, then you have to parch it because you want to quickly turn it into flour. You don't have time to let it dry out. You parch it to dry it out, and then you turn it into flour. Well, okay, who's snacking on flour? Do you ever go into your kitchen and snack on flour? Nobody snacks on flour. I mean, I have seen it on occasion, but it's quite rare that people snack on flour. So that's why we're not worried anyone's going to eat it, because it's flour. But they say v'haravashi berutahi or bedutahi. That's a word every time it appears. They're not sure if it's beruta. Bar means outside, meaning there's no place for it. Or beduta, it's like a joke. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. Tinach mikali ve'elach. I get it when it's at the stage of the flour, but once they parch it. But ad kali, before they parch it, ma'ika l'meimer, people could snack on raw wheat. Okay, it's soft at that point. I mean, I don't know if you've ever snacked on that stuff, but I don't usually see the flour the wheat when it's in that form, so I can't really say. But they're basically saying before that, it is possible to snack on it. After that, it's interesting. There's sugyas that talk about chewing on grains. So, but that's usually, I would think, after they're parched. Anyway, what he's saying is there is an earlier stage in the process where you could be snacking on it, and that's the concern. Now, let's bring in the earlier Rabba, like Rabba said, but wait, you could say at the earlier stage, basically it's where it's snackable, but that's when you're picking it in the fields. And we already said you pick it by hand, so you'll already remember. So maybe you could say that, but Beit HaShlachin, but not if you're doing a Beit HaShlachin, and there it's permitted, and then we could get grains from there, right? And you might eat them. So therefore, Elahad Ravashi Berutahi. Okay, that's not a good answer, because it only resolves the later stage, but not the earlier stage, where there still could be a concern of snacking. With that, we finished the sugya. So the basic structure was we had 3 answers to figure out how Rabbi Yehuda differs in the 2 sugya and why there would be a distinction. Really only the middle one we accepted, which was this chadash you're used to not eating, whereas chametz you're not. And then within that, we had to bring the rabbis who would say the opposite. Right? The rabbis specifically think that chadash is more likelihood you're going to eat and chametz not, because you're going to burn it. Of course, you're not going to eat it. Okay. And that's just interesting in terms of, right, both the idea of snacking, which we're all very familiar with, and the idea of, what was I about to say? About, what concerns, what things we have to, is it okay to do, right? Where the rabbis got involved and said, we're worried people are going to do this, we're not worried people are going to do it, and, the different possible distinctions to be made. Okay, now we're going to get to the next topic, which is the Omer. Mishakarav HaOmer. Okay, now the Chadash, really. Mishakarava Omer Hutar Chadash Miyad. So we've been discussing the process of doing the Korban Omer. Now we're up to the stage where it gets brought on the altar. Now what happens? Big Chagiga, right? Big celebration. Everyone can now, right? That was what we just saw in the last Mishnah. In the Shuk, they were already selling all the Chadash stuff. Everyone can now eat Chadash. What is it? What determines when you can eat Chadash? Seems pretty simple, right? The Korban Omer being sacrificed. Well, maybe this is clear, maybe it's not clear. First of all, what do you do when there's no temple? That's going to be the first question. And I'm going to show you a problem in the Pasuk. Okay? V'lechem v'kali v'karmel lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. We're in Vayikra 23:14. Don't eat lechem, kali, karmel, ad etzem hayom hazeh, until, okay, good question what etzem hayom hazeh means. Often we think it means the middle of the day. No one's really going to say it means the middle of the day here. Either the beginning of the day or the end of the day, we're going to see. Okay? Ad haviyachem et korban Elohechem. Until you bring the korban. This is very confusing. Until the etzem hayom hazeh or until the korban. So first of all, we don't even know what etzem hayom hazeh means. The other issue is, number one, what is etzem hayom hazeh? Right? Again, it's hard to translate that word. And ad means until. Whenever we have the word until, there's a machloket always. Is it ad up to and including, or up to and not including? Right? This is whenever I say, right, you can do this until Monday. Does that mean until Monday, as soon as Monday hits, no, or until the end of Monday? Okay, you have to be clear. So ad is always a confusing word. So that's going to lead us to a big debate. But the bigger question is, why does it give us 2 factors? One depends on the day and one depends on the bringing of the korban. That's contradictory. So the Mishnah says, Mishakarava Omer Hutar Chadash Miyad. Okay, the Mishnah seems very clear. It's the korban Omer. Harichokim utarim mechatzot hayom ulahalan. Now, if you live far away, midday. We're going to get back to why this is. What's the problem? The midday, right? The people live far away have no idea when the Korban Omer was brought. Okay, so we need some time for them to know when they can eat Chadash. Right? They don't have to find out till they find out 3 weeks later that the Korban was brought. Mishacharav Beit HaMikdash. Okay, now we get to what about when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed? And this is very famous because Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is known to have instituted a lot of things after the Korban was destroyed. This comes up in Sukkah. There were all sorts of things in Sukkah. And they quote this Mishnah there as well. Hitkim Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai shehei yom hanef kulo asur. He basically says, after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, the whole day of Tetzayim was forbidden because of a takana of the rabbis. Now, what he doesn't say is what happens before the rabbis instituted this. Okay, what's the Ikar Adin? What does the Torah say about this? So it seems like, now here it's unclear, and we're going to kind of get this from later on in the sugya, that, well, let's go on one more minute. Maybe I'll just leave it right now as it's unclear. It's unclear what he thinks the Torah law is, okay? But from the next line, you can figure that he probably doesn't think the Torah law is what Rabbi Yehuda says, because what does Rabbi Yehuda say? Amar Rabbi Yehuda v'lo menat Torah asur. He says, what do you mean? It's not a takan of the rabbis. It's forbidden by Torah law. Shenemar ad etzem hayom hazeh. Ad etzem hayom hazeh, how does Rabbi Yehuda understand it? Until the end of the day and up to and including, right? Until the etzem hayom hazeh is completely completed, which means the end of the day. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I agree with you that Yom HaNefesh is kolo asur once the temple is destroyed, but not because of the rabbinic law, but by Torah law. That's how I understand the pasuk. Now, how does Rabbi Yochanan, now I want to get to, how does Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai understand the pasuk? There's two options, really. One is maybe he thinks midday, ad etzem hayom hazeh is midday, or maybe he thinks morning. Now we're going to see nobody thinks that it's midday. We're going to see 4 Amoraim that all say morning, when the sun rises. So the assumption in the Gemara is going to be that Rabbanyo, at least at first, because we're going to see there's going to be a whole discussion. But the initial assumption of the Mishnah is, number one, it's clear Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda. He doesn't think the end of the day by Torah law. Again, by rabbinic law, yes. By Torah law, no. So he must think morning, because nobody thinks midday. Even though in other places like Pesach, etzem hayom hazeh means the middle of the day. But leaving that aside, they think ad means up to, and not including, up to the day. And the day is the morning, and that's the explanation. Okay? So we assume at this point, or certainly when we get to the Gemara, we're going to assume he thinks to the morning by Torah law. And then Rabbi Yehuda says, no, by Torah law it's forbidden the whole day. So now you can also just understand, what's this ad aviyachem and ad etzem hayom hazeh? Well, one is when there's a temple, and one is when there's no temple. When you don't bring the korban ha'omer, then it's etzem hayom hazeh, which could be morning, could be night. Okay, now, mipnei ma rechokim utarim mechatzot hayom ulahalan. So then Rabbi Yehuda says, right, when the omer is brought, why are the distant people able to bring mechatzot? Mipnei sheim yodim sheim beit hadin mitatzlim bo. Okay, they know that the court won't be lazy about it. We know, interesting they say the court, because it's really also the kohanim, but they know they'll bring the korban omer on time, because the court was like in charge of it. Okay, now we get to these 4 Amoraim. We're going to have Rav and Shmuel, who disagree with Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, but they both agree on one basic premise, which is what I told you already, that by Torah law, when there's no temple, it's Ha'ir Mizrach. It's when the sun rises. It's going to be permitted, and that's what we're going to assume Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai must hold that, because otherwise they're not holding by any Tana. Okay? Rav Shmuel, it's a bit of a confusing sugya, and I'll tell you why. Because the assumptions we're going to make at the beginning of the sugya are going to be completely different at the end of the sugya. Okay, so that's why I'm being very careful about saying these are assumptions made about Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai. Rav Shmuel to Amir Travaim. Now they don't make any relation to Rabbi Yehuda, to Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai. They just talk. I also want you to remember Rabbi Yehuda lived a few generations after Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai. It wasn't like they were communicating with each other. Okay, there was Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai's opinion earlier, and comes Rabbi Yehuda a few generations later and says, "What are you talking about?" Okay, because Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai was right after the destruction, and Rabbi Yehuda was at the end of the Tannaitic time period, or toward the end. Rav Shmuel to Amir Travaim. Bizman shebeit hamikdash kayam, Omer matir. Okay, so they say very simply, like we said before, when the temple's around, the Omer permits. Bizman she'ein beit hamikdash kayam, Ha'ir Mizrach matir. Okay, but when the Beit HaMikdash isn't around, it's the sunrise. Now, we're going to assume that they in the end agree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana, and by rabbinic law, the whole day is going to be forbidden. But what they're talking about here is by Torah law. And what they're explaining is the psukim, as we're going to see right now. My time. So the Gemara explains their reasoning. Traits, cry, k'tiv. There's 2 psukim. K'tiv ad aviyachem, u'k'tiv ad etzem hayom hazeh. The exact problem I brought up before. It says until you bring the omer, and it says until the day. Ha-ketzad, how does this work? Comes Beit HaMikdash Kayam, comes man she'ein Beit HaMikdash Kayam. One part of the pasuk is talking about when there's a temple, one part of the pasuk is talking about when there's no temple and you can't bring the korban. Okay, that's pretty standard. That's kind of what we thought. Here comes Rabbi Yochanan v'Rish Lakish. The Amrit Travayu. Afilu b'zman she'Beit HaMikdash Kayam, Ha'ir Mizrach matir. This sounds very radical. Even when the temple's around, it's not the Omer that's matir, it's the Beit HaMikdash. It's the sun rising. Okay, the sunrise permits. We're going to have 4 difficulties on this. We're going to go like this. One from the pasuk, because the pasuk says it. Ad aviyachem et omer tznufa. What are you going to do with that? Then we're going to have a problem from the Mishnah, problem from our next Mishnah, and then another problem from a Mishnah based on an explanation of the Amoraim. Okay? So we're going to go like this. First question. V'haktiv adav yachem. Doesn't it say until you bring the Omer? How can you say it doesn't depend on bringing the Omer sacrifice? To which they answer, la mitzvah. Okay, that's just ideal. But by bottom law halacha, morning is fine. Okay? Ideally, you should wait till the Omer is brought, but you don't have to wait. You can really eat it in the morning. And that's going to be the general answer to most of the questions. Next question. Look at our Mishnah. Okay, forget the pasuk. Our Mishnah says it. Mishkarava Omer hutar chadash miyad. Right? When you bring the sacrifice of the Omer, then the chadash is permitted. La mitzvah, again, that's the ideal. Ideally, you should wait. But if you eat the chadash in the morning, it's totally fine. Ha-Omer, third. This is going to be a Mishnah we're going to see later today. Ha-Omer hayamatir b'medina u'shtei halechem b'mikdash. Okay, this is very important, especially for the end of today's daf, which is to know some background here. And this is, I think we've discussed this, but we'll discuss it again and clarify it. When you bring the sacrifice of the Omer, what happens? Well, we saw this in the Mishnah. It permits chadash, all the new crops from last Nisan, right? Anything that grew in this past year is now permitted to eat. Okay? Now, shtei alechem b'mikdash. Shtei alechem permits in the temple. Now, the new crop is allowed by everyone to eat after that Kravat Omer, but you're not allowed to bring it on the altar yet. All the Menachot you bring from before Shavuot, okay, starting from the Nisan, but even from the previous year, okay. In other words, even from earlier in the year, right? You can't bring anything from the new crop until you get to the Shtei Alechem, and you bring a korban Shtei Alechem on the altar. Remember the difference between them? One of the differences, we'll get to this later today as well. The Omer is brought from barley. This isn't important for this. This is just a difference. The Omer is brought from barley. The Shtei Alechem is from wheat. And the barley, just so you get it straight, the barley permits all the new grains, not just barley. It permits wheat, permits all the new grains to be eaten by everybody, but it doesn't permit them to be brought on the altar. And only once you bring the Shtei Alechem are you now permitted to bring all the menachot from the new crop on the altar. So anyway, the point being, the Omer was matir b'medina. There it seems very clear. The Omer is what permits, not, right? So again, the mitzvah. Okay. Third question answered in the same way. So we had a pasuk and two mishnayot, which all seem to go against the way Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan explained, that it's just the sunrise which permits it, but they said the sunrise really does permit, but ideally you should wait till after the Omer is offered. Question number 4. Mishacharav Beit HaMikdash, our Mishnah, hitkin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai sheyeh yom hanef kulo asul. Now, the Amoraim asked, my taima, what's the reason? Why did he do this yom hanef kulo asul? Okay, we're at the top of Amud Bet now. Meheira yibaneh Beit HaMikdash. Remember, he was living right after the destruction of the temple. And they felt at that point like the temple is going to be built tomorrow, maybe. V'yomru, and what will happen? If we permit the Omer on Tet Zayin earlier in the day, what will they say? Well, when the next year comes and we have a temple, Eshtakan milo achalnu be'ir mizrach. If you permit it from the morning, people will say, oh, don't you remember last year we ate it in the morning? Hashtanami nechal. So now we can eat the chadash in the morning. V'lo yadeh, and they'll forget. Again, this is just typical, right? But we talked earlier in the daf about people just snacking, right? Here you have people just don't remember, right? They remember what we did last year, and they won't realize the nuances. They don't get the nuances of all this, and they won't remember. V'lo yadeh de eshcha lo hava omer hi'ir mizrach matir. They won't remember that because there was no omer last year. That's why the sunrise permitted it. V'hashtadi ka omer, but now that there's the korban omer, only the Omer is matir, and not a Ir Mizrach. Now, Isa kadatach lemitzvah. Now, if you're going to say no, let's just get what's going on here. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai institutes a rabbinic ordinance to prevent mistakes from happening. What mistake are they trying to prevent? They're preventing people eating chadash when there's a temple from the morning, from the sunrise. But that makes no sense, because Isa kadatach lemitzvah. If, according to Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, he thinks that actually by Torah law it's really okay from the morning. It's just ideally wait till the Omer is brought. Well, mishum mitzvah lekam v'ligzor. So a year where we don't even have the Omer, what, we're going to make a gzera? What if next year? So what if next year they accidentally ate from the morning? That would be okay. They just didn't fulfill it in the ideal manner. But you don't make a gzeira so that in case people forget next year, which we don't even know if next year there's going to be a temple, right? That seems pretty unlikely that he would make a gzeira for that reason. And therefore, they assume that actually, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai b'shitat Rabbi Yehuda Amara, Da'amar min haTorah Asul. Shneamar ad etzem hayom hazeh ad itzumo shel yom v'kasavar ad va'ad bichlal. Here comes the most radical statement. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, now, what we're doing is basically saying, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish make no sense, basically, in light of the machloket Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Yehuda. It certainly doesn't match Rabbi Yehuda, that he Mizrach, and it certainly doesn't match Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai for the reason we just explained. Even if you tried to say, ideally, you should wait, but you can really do it from the morning, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai holds, which is what we thought, and that's where he disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, from the morning, really, it's fine. And Rabbi Yehuda says, only at night, and that's their big machlok, okay? But now, comes Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak and says, no, that can't be it, because if he really thought that you could do it from the morning, then he certainly wouldn't have instituted the Yom HaNev Kula Asul when there's no temple, because it would just be Xera for no real reason. So, comes Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak and basically says, which is, we're going to have to figure out how this works, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai agrees with Rabbi Yehuda completely. Okay, now you're going to say there's major problems with this, and we'll see. So basically, what does Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai say? Min haTorah, the whole day is asur, and this is exactly how we explain Rabbi Yehuda. Ad etzem hayom hazeh is ad itzumo shel yom, until the end of the day, really it means, and ad va'ad bichlal, it goes until, right, the center of the day, until the end of the center of the day, which is going to end at the end of the day. So even if you say Yitzumo is, let's say, center or Ikar of the day, but it means until the end of that. So now the Gemara is going to say, okay, first of all, what do you mean? He disagreed with him, remember? How could you possibly say they say the same thing? There's two opinions in the Mishnah, and they disagree with each other. Ditnan, we're going to read it right now again, in case you don't remember. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, who clearly is saying, I disagree with you, because he said, okay, what did Rabbi Yehuda say? How could you say it's a rabbinic ordinance? It's forbidden by Torah law, which means Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai didn't think it was forbidden by Torah law, so how could we possibly come and say he did? Well, you could say like this. Rabbi Yehuda, hu dekatai, Rabbi Yehuda was mistaken. Remember, he came a few generations later, and he heard what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai thought, and he thought that was what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying, but he was wrong. Hu savar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai midu Rabbanan kamar. He thought Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was talking on a rabbinic level. Velohi, midoraita kamar, but it wasn't. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he said the rabbis institute, okay, you can already see the problem with this, the rabbis institute, the whole day is going to be forbidden, really meant by Torah law. Okay, that's a little strange, but that's what we're going to explain right now, to which the Gemara is going to say, ha hitkin katani, but it says hitkin. What is hitkin? Rabbinic ordinance, right? The rabbis instituted something. So they say, no, my hitkin, darash v'hitkin. What does hitkin mean? Hitkin means they looked into the psukim and figured out what the psukim mean. Okay, now remember, before this there was a temple. So only after the temple was destroyed did they have to start figuring out, how do we read these psukim? Ad v'yachem, ad etzem hayom hazeh, ad v'yachem must be when there's a temple. Ad etzem hayom hazeh must be when there's no temple. And then he said, well, what does ad etzem hayom hazeh mean? And then he got to the conclusion that Rabbi Yehuda got to later also. And then we're going to say there's really no machloket. Rabbi Yehuda just didn't understand. He thought it was Xera D'Rabbanan, and that's why I said, what are you talking about? From the Torah is forbidden. But he was just wrong. No, he was wrong about how he understood Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, there's a big problem with this sugya, which is what? According to this interpretation, now it resolved our previous problem, but according to this interpretation, right, it was our previous problem with Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, really. But now we have another problem, which is if Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Yehuda both think that from the Torah it's forbidden to the end of the day, then how did both Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish come up with their own opinion that from the morning it's okay, right? That really is not addressed by the sugya. So while we've resolved one problem, we've actually created another. So there's different options that the commentaries give. I'll mention one, even though it's got a little bit of a weak point to it, which is that I told you before, there's a big machloket, Abba Bichlal, is it up to and including or up to not including? And since we know there's a machloket Tanaim about it, we can just assume there must be Tanaim who understand ad here also as until and not including. The weakness of it is it's also a difference of how you interpret it ad etzem hayom hazeh. Do you interpret it more like until the morning or until the nighttime? And then you still kind of have a problem. And without really any Tanaic source, it's a little hard to understand how those Amoraim went that way. Okay? Now, again, this was to resolve some difficulty. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak explained it this way. There might be some people, and we're going to see in a minute, who still understand Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is really saying it's only rabbinic. Okay, so we're left with a lot of lack of clarity about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and then really lack of clarity about these four Amoraim. Who are they going by? So there's a lot of unanswered questions in the sugya. Now we're going to continue. Now we're going to talk about another topic within this, which is what do you do in Chutz La'aretz? Now in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, you have 2 days of Yantif. Why do you have 2 days of Yantif? Because you're not sure what day is what. So if Tet Zayin ben Nisan is the day we permit it, well, what about Yud Zayin, which is maybe Tet Zayin? So are you allowed to eat Chadash on Yud Zayin? And also, who do we hold by? So you're going to see right now 3 opinions. Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua achle chadash be'orta deshitzar nage shivsar. Okay, that orta means the night of the 16th going into the 17th, which basically means night of Yud Zayin, right? So already if Tet Zayin passes, you can already eat it. By the end of Tet Zayin, you can already then eat on Yud Zayin. You don't have to worry about it at all. Why? Kasavre chadash b'chutz la'aretz derabanan. Well, the other issue is chadash outside of Israel, is it an Torah prohibition? Is chadash only a prohibition in Israel? And then it's only rabbinic outside of Israel. If you say it's rabbinic, then you're already going to be much more lenient because you're going to say l'sfeika lo cheshinan, right? It's already rabbinic, safek d'Rabbanan l'kula. So since we're talking about sfeika d'yoma, we don't know which day is which, right? But you don't have to worry about that on a rabbinic issue. Rabbanan, second opinion, Rabbanan debei Rav Ashi, achla b'tzafra d'shivsar. They would eat on the 17th in the morning. They wouldn't eat at night on the 17th, only in the morning. Why? Kasavre chadash b'chutz la'aretz doraita. So they held the chadash is doraita, and therefore you do have to worry about sfeika d'yoma. So you can't start at night. But what else do they hold? Well, this is where I said we're going to see this. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai midrabanan kamar, not like Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai actually held this as only rabbinic. The takana was a takana de Rabbanan. By rabbinic law, it's permitted already in the morning. So now you get it. He instituted this rabbinic ordinance when it's definitely the 16th, but when it's only a suffix at the 16th, he didn't institute it. So then we go back to the basic Torah law, which is from the morning. And the third opinion, which you can guess already, Amar Ravina, Amar Li'em, my mother told me, Avuch lo hava acha, your father wouldn't eat chadash, ela be'orta deshivsar nage timnaiser. He would be the most machmir and wait till the 17th, till the 18th, basically at night. Okay, once the 17th was fully over. You can imagine what he holds. Savra la ki Rabbi Yehuda v'chayish l'sfeika. And where he says Rabbi Yehuda is, once the temple's not around and there's no Omer, it's by Torah law. And you're worried about Safek, right? Safek d'oraita, you're going to be machmir. Okay, next Mishnah, which we already read the beginning part, Ha'omer hayamatir b'medina u'shtei alechem b'mikdash. So the Omer permits, again, people to eat the new crop, but the new grains, but the shtei alechem permits it only for the temple. Okay, you still can't bring them in the temple until the shtei alechem is brought on Shavuot. So you can't bring mincha from the new crop, or bikurim, which normally we think we bring on Shavuot, but if you wanted to bring new fruits to the temple earlier, or like let's say we're going to see also for wine libations. What if you want to bring new wine? You can't bring it before the Omer, or for mincha behema, for the nisachim that go with the regular animal sacrifices. V'imevi pasul, and if you did, it's disqualified. If you bring something from the new crop on the altar before the Omer, completely disqualified. Now also before shtei alechem, but we're going to see there's a difference. Kodem l'shtei alechem lo yavi v'imevi kashil. Now before the shtei alechem, you also can't bring because that's what we said. It permits it on the altar only after the shtei alechem, and it also, by the way, permits bikurim only after the shtei alechem is brought, which includes like your new fruits that you're supposed to bring on Shavuot. First, the shtei alechem has to come, then the bikurim. But if you brought it anyway earlier, it's okay. As long as it's past the Omer, we'll accept it. So Yativ Rabbi Tarfon b'kakashele ma ben kodem la'omer lekodem shtei alechem. I don't understand this distinction, Rabbi Tarfon said. Why would it be okay, even though you're not supposed to do it, it would be accepted, your mincha, if it's between the Omer and the shtei alechem? To which, Amar Lefanav Yehuda bar Nechemya, notice he doesn't even have the name of a rabbi, and he says to him, Lo, what do you mean? Why do you have a question? It's obvious. Im Amarta Kodem La'omer Shekain Lo Utar Michalo Etzel Hedya. What's the difference? The difference is Chadash is completely not permitted anywhere before the Omer, to regular people. So, of course, if you bring it on the altar, it's going to be completely disqualified. But your Tomal, you're going to say the same thing. Kodem L'Shtei Alechem, Shu Utar Michalo Etzel Hedyot. But after the Omer is brought, and before the Shtei Alechem, it's already permitted to regular people to eat. So if it's permitted to regular people to eat, then you shouldn't bring it on the altar. But if you did, we'll accept your korban. We're not going to disqualify it. So he says there's an obvious distinction. Shatak Rabbi Tarfon. So Rabbi Tarfon was silent. Seems like he realized, oh yeah, that's pretty clear and obvious. And Sahavu Panav Shel Yehuda bar Nechemya. Okay, and he got his face lit up like, oh, I stumped the rabbi, right? Like, I had the answer that Rabbi Tarfon didn't. I'm so proud of myself. And Amar lo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva saw this and says to him, Yehuda, tzavu panecha sheishavte et zaken. Your eyes lit up. I saw that when you had you got your rabbi. Timhani im tarich yamim. I'm not sure you're going to actually live very long. Okay, basically, humiliating your rabbi is up there on the top list of things you shouldn't do. And in Talmudic stories, when you do something wrong, usually you die. And in fact, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli, he's the Rabbi Yehuda who's mentioned in the Mishnah all the time, says that Oto Perek Pros HaPesach Hayah, this is great, it's 2 weeks before Pesach, exactly where we are. Okay, so that time, it was just before Pesach, 2 weeks before. Kshaliti Latzeret, so that story happened 2 weeks before Pesach. When I went on Shavuot, I went up to Rabbi Tarfon's house, because that's what they would do on the holidays. They would go to the rabbi's house. Houses Sha'alti Acharav. I asked about him. Yehuda ben Nechemya Hechanu. Where is he? Why is he not here? V'amruli Niftar V'alachlo. And they said he died. He's no longer here. Wow. Okay. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. L'divrei, by the same Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak we saw before. L'divrei Yehuda ben Nechemya Nisachim bikurim shekrivu kodem la'omer kshirim. He says the following. According to what Yehuda bar Nechemya, the distinction he made, he said that the Omer matirs these things, right? So once they're matiring them, then it's okay if they go on the altar. Well, now he says, what about wine? Wine that's bikurim. So you have new wine from the New Year's crop, and you've never brought them to the temple yet, so you're not supposed to bring them until after the Shtei Alechem. But ikrivum kodem la'omer kshirim, right? Just like we said, right? The way he explained it. So if you bring it before the Shtei Alechem, it's fine, because it wasn't even... It's not forbidden to everyone to drink wine. Everyone can drink the wine. I mean, first of all, even the Omer doesn't permit it, right? There's no issue of drinking the new wine. The only problem is you can't bring the new wine, right? Chadash is only for grains. It's not for grapes. So if you make wine with new grapes and you eat them, even before Nisan, it's fine, okay? So for sure, before the Omer, before the Shtei Alechem, it'll be totally fine. To which they say, Pshita, okay, it's pretty obvious. Why are you telling us this from Nachman bar Yitzchak? Well, he says, because Ma'u detema, you might have thought. Hatam hudu tar michalo etzel hedyot. In the Omer, what happens? The korban Omer permits the grains. Because they got permitted, therefore, if you bring them on the altar, because they're permitted to everybody to eat now, so if you brought them on the altar, it's okay. But maybe you would say that's because there was an act that permitted them, the bringing of the Omer. And maybe that's why if we bring it before Shtei Alechem on the altar, it's okay. Aval hacha, but you might have thought, this is why he had to say it, it's not true. But you might have thought, hacha de lo tar michlalo. But there's nothing that matures the wine ever. In other words, maybe it was specifically because there was a korban Omer that matured it. But otherwise, you just have, you can't bring new things until the Shtei Alechem is brought. And there's no heter at all for wine because there's no isser for wine, but there's no heter for it. No act that matured it. You might have thought maybe if you brought it on the altar before you can, it's disqualified. Kamash balan koshken hachadilo itzer kla. He comes saying, no. Of course there was no prohibition ever for wine to be drunk by people. So of course, the new crop. So of course, you can, if you did it on the altar before the Shtei Alechem, it would be fine. Okay, so he was kind of saying you might have thought not, but yes. By Rami Bar Chama. Now we're going to start this siman here for 4 questions that Rami Bar Chama is going to ask. We're only going to do the first one today. It's a bit complicated. Shtei halechem ma'u shiatiru shelo kisidran. Okay, can the Shtei Alechem permit not in the right order? What is he talking about? We're going to see right now. Hechidami. Kigon dezar'inhu ben ha'omer l'Shtei Alechem. V'chalef alayu Shtei Alechem va'omer. Mai. let's say you plant a crop. Normally you plant the crops in the winter. That's when the rain comes and that's the normal time. And then you're going to hit into the Omer and then the Shtei Lechem. So the Omer is going to permit it to people to eat and the Shtei Lechem is going to permit it on the altar. But what if you did something strange and you planted an Iyar? Okay? So you plant an Iyar after the Omer was brought already. So he wants to know, you planted it and it took root before the Shtei Lechem sacrifice was brought. V'chalif alayu Shtei Lechem va'Omer. Now, the Shtei Lechem comes. Now, that can't permit that crop yet to be on the Mizbeach because you haven't, what do you need to permit it? Well, you need to pass an Omer and a Shtei Lechem, right? You have to have the Hakravat Omer, which first permits it to everyone to eat, and then you have the Shtei Lechem that permits it to sacrifice. In this case, you're going to have it in the opposite order. You're going to have the Shtei Lechem first because it happened in Iyar. It doesn't pass yet. It didn't pass the Omer. Passes the Shtei Lechem. Well, that can't permit it yet because it didn't have an Omer and Shtei Lechem yet. But then when you get to the Omer of the next year, perhaps then, since it already had the Shtei Lechem earlier and the Omer, maybe that crop you planted in Iyar will be able to go on the altar already right after the Omer was brought. That's the question of, do we say, my, kisidron sharian, shalo kisidron lo sharian? Maybe it says you have to have it in that order. It has to pass the Omer and pass the Shtei Lechem in that order. And then this wouldn't work. You would have to wait till it basically gets, first it's, right, so Iyar, then you're going to bring the Shtei Lechem in Sivan. That's going to be one Shtei Lechem. But that doesn't work when you have the Omer, because you're going to need Shtei Lechem, Omer, and Shtei Lechem. Because you really need, right, the first Shtei Lechem is irrelevant. You're going to need an Omer and a Shtei Lechem first. So it's only going to be permitted Sivan of the next year. Or, Odilma Shalo Kasidra Nami Sharian. Or maybe you would say it does permit it, because you got a Shtei Lechem and an Omer. Who cares if it was in the wrong order? As long as it passes one cycle of a year and having in it both that the Shtei Lechem was brought and the Omer was brought, maybe you can already bring that crop that took root in Iyar already on the altar next Iyar, basically, or next Nisan after the Omer is brought. That's his question. So Amar Rabba Tashma. Rabba says we're going to learn it from here. Now here it gets a little complicated. The beginning part is very easy. We're going to have 3 different proofs. The first 2 are irrelevant to us. 3 different proofs, we're off topic for a minute, of how we know that the Omer was brought from barley. Okay, it doesn't really say so explicitly in the Torah. So Tashma, v'im takriv mincha. So let's learn from this source. In takriv mincha bikurim. That's the pasuk in chapter 2. By the way, we're going to read this in shul tomorrow. We're getting to Vayikra, which is exciting this year because we've been learning all about the korbanot. In takriv mincha bikurim. So what's this mincha bikurim? B'minchata Omer hakatuv b'daber. It must be the minchata Omer. Mehecham ba, where does it come from? Minasorim, from the barley. So now they say, Ataomer minasorim oelim alachitim. How do you know it's barley and not wheat? Never says it in the psukim. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ne'amar Aviv, okay, it talks about, it says, Mincha bikurim la'Hashem, Aviv kaloi. What is Aviv? Well, it says Aviv in Mitzrayim, v'ne'amar Aviv l'derot. Ma Aviv hamor b'Mitzrayim se'orim. Now, where does it say it? In Makat Barad, in the hail. It says, Vapishta v'aseora nukata, okay, the flax and the barley was hit. Ki aseora aviv v'apishta givol. So it says the barley is aviv. So there you see, it says aviv by us. Aviv must be barley. Af aviv hamor l'dorot se'orim. So the aviv that talks about for future generations must be also barley. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Matzinu yachid shemivi chovato menachitim v'chovato menaseorim. An individual, sometimes they bring their obligation from wheat. That's most minachot, minchat chotei. And to bring chovato menaseorim, the minchat knaot is from barley. And likewise, we have tzibur shemiviim chovatam menachitim, miviim chovatam menaseorim. And the communal offerings are usually brought from wheat, but also there are ones brought from barley. Now, if the Omer is brought from wheat, there is no other. All the other offerings we know they're brought from wheat. So there would be nothing. This is what we call process of elimination. Must be the Omer because there's nothing else left. But now this is the important one for our purposes. Tavar achir. Now Rabbi Akiva adds one other reason. If you say the Omer comes from the wheat, then Shtei Lechem won't be bikurim. And it says in the pasuk, you're going to bring bikurim mincha chadasha. Has to be something new. Now, if we already brought the mincha Omer from wheat, then bringing wheat on Shavuot won't be new. And that's what happens. This is why I said the mincha Omer is barley. Excuse me 1 minute. The mincha would be barley, and the shtei omer, the shtei lechem is wheat. If they're both wheat, then the shtei lechem isn't something new. You already brought one on the altar before. That's the main point. Now, let's go back to our case. If you could say it goes out of order, then you could have a new crop that's brought for the shtei lechem that wasn't brought at the omer, because the omer could have been wheat, and the shtei lechem could be wheat, but you could be bringing from that stuff in Iyar, which from that crop you never brought on Shavuot. That's the bottom line. Let's read it inside. Mishkacha. So im ita d'shtei lechem shelo kesidron sharia. Now here's our answer to the question, because if you say out of order, it's not permitted. Sorry. So shtei lechem shelo, if it's out of order, it would be permitted. Then you would have a case where the shtei lechem could be bikurim, even though they're both wheat. Okay, and it's so obvious to Rabbi Akiva that would never happen. So that would answer that it must be shtei lechem shelo kesidron isn't permitted. Okay, so let's read it. Mishkach alad makliv omer mehanach de'ishush kodem l'shtei lechem ubatar omer de'eshteked. You could bring the omer from the wheat that took root before the shtei lechem, from that crop in Iyar, before the shtei lechem, ubatar omer de'eshteked. In other words, okay, that's basically where you're going to bring it from, but you're going to bring it from specifically. Now, normally you're going to bring it from something later in the year, because you usually plant later in the year. But if you happen to plant in the spring, but before Shavuot, then the following year, the omer could be brought from that, okay? Now, but shtei lechem, you wouldn't bring from then, you could bring from the crop that was planted later in the year, like in the summer, okay? Mehanach de ishrush kodem ha'omer dahashta, which would be before this year's omer, the second year, ubatar shtei lechem de'eshka, but after last year's shtei lechem. So basically, you could have two different crops. One from, let's say, one from the spring, one from the summer. So you bring the omer from the spring, and you bring the shtei lechem from the summer, and they're both wheat, and they're both called new, because this one is the new for that crop. And that would prove then there would be a case where bikurim could happen if they were wheat and wheat, and Rabbi Akiva basically says there is no such thing. So it must be shelo kesidron wouldn't help. So now they reject this answer, because they say, mi savar bikurim lepere kamrinan, limizbeach kamrinan. You can't call the spring and the one you planted in the spring and the one you planted in the summer, that's bikurim and that's a different bikurim. No, that's not the way bikurim work. Bikurim don't go based on the fruit, like this crop or that crop. It's limizbeach kamrinan, where basically when you go on the altar and you bring a korban and the mincha omer, that's the first you're bringing this year from last year's crops. It's all about the mizbeach having a first fruit. And once the omer hits, you've already done something for the previous year crop. So even if it doesn't matter summer, spring, it's all the previous year's crop. So that doesn't, basically, it wouldn't be called bikurim if that one was brought from the summer and the other one was brought from the earlier crop. It wouldn't call it bikurim anyway. So that doesn't answer your question at all, because you still wouldn't have a case of bikurim, and you would still be able to prove that barley and then wheat, but it still could be, right? So we don't know really in the end whether it could be or not, because this doesn't necessarily prove whether this matirs it or doesn't matir it. Okay, so that won't give you an answer. Okay, that's the end of our daf. We'll go through very quickly. We started with the different, what people forget, what people don't, right? Will they accidentally eat? Will they not? In which case, what are we more worried about? We have the three answers for the contradiction between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda, and the rabbis and Rabbi Meir, the ones who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, we have one answer. But even in the three, we rejected two of them. Then we got to the what matirs chadash, and we had a whole debate, right? During the time of the temple, not the time of the temple, we had all different possible opinions about how to understand Rabbi Yochanan and Sakai. Was really Takanat Rabbanan, or did they just kind of institute something that they understood from how they read the Torah, and it was really Torah law? He doesn't really disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda just misunderstood him. That was one way, or maybe he really thinks it's all rabbinic, and we saw different approaches to understanding, although we were left with some questions based on the Amoraim, who don't really seem to match up with any of the opinions then, if we understand Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai is thinking nighttime, right, by the end of the day only, because they all seem to say in the morning is fine. And then we got to what do you do with Sveika Diyoma, and that really depends on what you hold on that whole machloket about when it's permitted, when there's no temple, and is it D'Rabbanan or D'Oraita in Chutz La'aretz, Chadash, and all that. And then we got to this Mishnah about the Omer Matir b'Medina She'alach b'Mikdash, and the difference between and the whole humiliation of Rabbi Tarfon, and Nehemiah ended up dying because of it. Even though he said something that was pretty obvious, you have to wonder why Rabbi Tarfon didn't catch that himself. And then we had the question of Rami Bar Chama, which we tried to answer but ended up without an answer. And we're going to continue with 3 more questions of Rami Bar Chama. That will wish everyone Shabbat Shalom. Maybe a peaceful Shabbat and quiet.